Margaret and I had the privilege of visiting the Holy Land twice when I was still a curate, 2010, 2011. So this is just to give you some orientation. I'm sure you'll know the geography very well, probably better than we do our own country, really, because we spend so much time talking about the Holy Land. But the big red cross that you can see down at the bottom shows the position of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Bethpage, Bethany, Emmaus, all those places that we know and love. Hopefully you can see that all right. And just the hill country around that area. I think this is around Bethlehem, actually. And it's still pretty much the same today, 2,000 years later, the same sort of scene with shepherds out in the lonely hilltops. But this is a picture of a plan of Jerusalem as it was at the time of Christ. And we're being a bit specific here, Sunday the 10th of April, AD 30. And I'm just going to quickly go over the events of the season of Easter, really. And I won't spend too long on these slides, but if ever you want to go back and look at them again, obviously you can do. And you may remember that Jesus spent the night in Bethany and then walked over the Mount of Olives and entered the city where really Holy Week got started. And that Palm Sunday is obviously a high point in his ministry. There's no doubt about who he is and the importance of his mission, at least in his mind. And as Cliff has pointed out in one of his sermons, at the same time as Jesus was riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, at the other side, the Roman military were parading in great force as well. So in a sense, there was a kind of competition going on between the two, and it was bound to end in conflict. But wonderful picture here from the Good News Bible. And just to give you an idea of what the countryside's like today, not quite as romantic as you might have hoped for, but this is Bethany, just where Jesus would have started his walk. And it's in a Palestinian part of the land and quite impoverished. You can see the rocky limestone features and caves roundabout, and I guess back then people would have been living in those places, so it's quite not surprising if Jesus had been born in a cave or a stable associated with a cave. Anyway, I won't dwell too long on these images, but there's quite a lot of poverty, and we went with an organisation called McCabe's, and they support some homes for orphans, for children who would otherwise be on the streets, and very worthwhile cause. And of course, today there's that route that Jesus took over the Mount of Olives and into Jerusalem is blocked by the security wall there, which has been put up to try and bring peace between the two sides. And I won't spend too long on this, but it is an area of dispute, as you know, and gradually the politics has changed and the occupied lands have shrunk down. The access for the Palestinian people is difficult. The shepherds have to take their flocks quite a long way to get to their traditional watering holes. Anyway, going back to how as it was 2,000 years ago, we know that Jesus was soon in conflict with the money changers in the temple, and I've shown that area highlighted. It is now occupied by the Muslims. There's the famous Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then the Dome of the Rock. That's the Golden Dome as well. But originally that was the site where Abraham is believed to have sacrificed his son, or been ready to sacrifice his son, but until a ram was seen in a thicket. And here's quite a nice model of the temple as it would have been at the time of Christ. there's the Dome of the Rock, unmistakable with the golden top there. And it's not actually a mosque, it's more of a kind of mausoleum, I believe. And I heard that an Irish company was responsible for putting the gold leaf on there some years ago. Quite magnificent. And you can see lots and lots, thousands and thousands of tombstones there, which have built up over the years. That's known as the Kidron Valley. You can see a bus going down in about the middle of the picture somewhere. And very famous place. And it has obviously changed an awful lot since the time of Christ. Shortly after Jesus throwing out the money changers in the temple, he was in discussion with the religious leaders, or argument with them more likely. And it was around that time that Judas contracted with the Pharisees and the other religious leaders to betray Jesus to them. What will you give me if I betray Jesus to you? Words that he was going to bitterly regret only a few days later. This is a picture of entry into the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. Everybody really, every male has got to wear one of these little caps to get close to the wall. And the men are separated from the women. The women are in the foreground behind a barrier, and the men are over there in the distance. And very often people stand and pray by the wall and leave their little prayer messages in little cracks in the wall. There's lots of interesting tunnels at the back of there, which we didn't have time to explore. But that's not why the Jewish people are interested in this wall. It's the significance that it's the last remnant of the temple, to which they normally have access. The Dome of the Rock, and then we're up to Wednesday now, when Jesus warned against religious leaders, calling them hypocrites and snakes. And then from the Mount of Olives, Jesus mourns over Jerusalem's rejection and pending destruction. And there is a church here, I think it's called the Teardrop Church, on the other side of the Kidron Valley, where Jesus is believed to have looked over the city. Of course, the golden Dome of the Rock wouldn't have been there back in those days, but the wall would have been around the city. And it expresses something of Jesus' compassion for people, that he's believed to have wept over that city, so much wanting to gather the people together as a hen would gather the chicks. And that's a mosaic in the floor in this Teardrop Chapel. And just a picture looking out with the barbed wire indicating the nature of relationships between the Jewish people, the Christians and the Muslims, and there are secular groups as well. There is a condition known as, I think it's Jerusalem fever, for people who go there and become kind of carried away with thoughts of the end times. And we're going to come to that in a few minutes about when we get on to the Ascension. But now we're on Thursday, what we call Maundy Thursday, Jesus having his Last Supper, going on into the Garden of Gethsemane to await his arrest. And it's believed that the Last Supper was held near the Zion Gate. And so Jesus would have gone down into the Kidron Valley and then walked up to Gethsemane, which I've highlighted in green, as you can see there. And obviously the Mount of Olives is over on the right. And another image from the Good News Bible. The Eucharist, or Holy Communion, is an essential part of our Christian heritage, and obviously every parish church is required to celebrate Holy Communion on a regular, if not weekly basis. Quite challenging in these times of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're trying to find ways of maintaining that intimacy which Christ offers us. The actual upper room is believed to be in this area. I doubt whether this is the actual upper room, but this is the one that the tourists are directed to today. And of course, there's not only Christians and Jewish people going to this place, but Muslims as well. And that strange yellow edifice you can see in the middle there is for the Muslims to gather around. It wasn't exactly the atmosphere that I'd expected when we visited this part of the city, but anyway, that's what it is. And then coming into the Garden of Gethsemane, and really there's just a fragment of the olive grove left now, probably 100 yards by 150 yards, whereas at one time it would have occupied a much bigger area. But these very ancient trees nearby. And then obviously we know about the confrontation in the garden as Jesus knelt there and prayed, and sadly his disciples fell asleep. The authorities came to arrest him, and Jesus famously told the disciples to put their swords away. He allowed himself to be arrested. Another image from the Good News Bible. And at the bottom of the hill near the Garden of Gethsemane, there in the valley bottom, there's this church for all the nations with rather beautiful but somber looking stained glass. And from there, Jesus would have been taken down the Kidron Valley, marched down there in the middle of the night, and his first trial was with Annas, the former Jewish high priest. It's quite likely that he received some physical roughing up at that point, and then taken to the current Jewish high priest, Caiaphas, and the Sanhedrin court. Further physical abuse, but I imagine the spiritual and social agonies he went through were just as bad. And finally, it's about 3 o'clock in the morning, imprisoned in Caiaphas's palace. And it was there in the outside that Peter was the only one, to his credit, who came that close to be with Christ. Took the risk of being in the courtyard there, but was identified and denied the Lord 3 times. And here's a depiction of Jesus being arrested and taken up the steps out of the Kidron Valley to be on trial, mock trial really, and imprisoned, abused overnight. And these are the very steps, apparently, which come up from the Kidron Valley to Caiaphas's house. And obviously tourists aren't allowed to walk on them, but at least you can look over the fence and see them. And there are dungeons under Caiaphas's palace. It's quite not sure whether they are dungeons or whether this was just a watering hole, because you can see that in the roof there's a place where buckets could have been lowered down. But there up above in the today there's this statue or monument to Peter's denial, the cockerel crowing there, and then in the distance you can see the Dome of the Rock, the golden dome in the distance. In the middle of the picture, in the distance there, that's the Mount of Olives, where we're heading for Ascension. The holy sites, as they're known, are built over largely by churches now, and yet there is some beautiful artwork there. This is one of the churches depicting Peter's rejection of Jesus and his subsequent remorse. So now we're at Good Friday. Various trials, trial 3, trial 4, well, trial 5 and trial 6. To be honest with you, I wasn't aware that Jesus had so many trials until I started looking into it. But Jesus obviously taken from the Jewish leaders over to the Roman authorities, because only they had the right to convict someone to capital punishment and execution. So these are really shocking and disturbing events which are still being played out for ordinary people today, and the thought that Jesus would have allowed himself to go through that is quite amazing. It shows the extent of God's love for creatures like us. And some more pictures here from the Good News Bible. The crowd being whipped up to shout for Barabbas to be set free rather than Jesus. Jesus would have then been taken out to Golgotha, outside the city wall, and this is actually believed to be the place where Pilate looked down from what is now that golden dome area and washed his hands of Jesus, allowing him then to be taken off and executed. Jesus forced to carry his own cross. If he must have been half dead by the time he got to Golgotha, following what's now known as the Via Dolorosa, a very narrow street which gets completely blocked up with visitors and pilgrims at certain times of the year. This is one of the little chapels that's been built to commemorate Jesus being flogged and beaten up along the way. These are quite disturbing places to visit, really. Although they look very beautiful when you see them like that, what they're actually depicting is something pretty horrible. And you see these sharp sort of branches that would have been pulled off the trees and wrapped around Jesus' head as a mock crown. All along the Via Dolorosa, there are certain marker points. This is number 5, where certain things have been believed to have happened. So that's our guide there, reaching out towards us. He was interesting character, and he actually came from Cana in Galilee, and we were able to have a good guide there. This is quite interesting because we've got all 3 religions depicted in the one slide. Right in the middle, there's the Jewish menorah. Up on the top there's the Islamic symbol, and over on the right, obviously with Jesus falling beneath the cross, we have the Christian presence as well, all along the Via Dolorosa. Just a quick detour into one of the shops. These amazing piles of spices and things. And we're going ever closer to the crucifixion site, which is now, of course, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But this is back in the place we visited earlier, which is a reconstruction of Jerusalem at the time of Christ, and the execution taking place outside the city wall. And now, you'd never believe it, but this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that built over the site of Jesus' crucifixion. Just as a matter of aside, if you look up on towards the right in the middle of the picture, there's a ladder on a ledge, and that's been there for many years because there's a dispute going on between the Christians, and it's the Muslim guy who actually has the key for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that ladder was put there, and they can't agree on who's going to move it. But yeah, there are all these political shenanigans going on even today. So this is up inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and is believed to be the site of the crucifixion. You actually go up some steps to what's left of a little hill, and you can queue and then kneel down under the altar and touch the very spot where this happened. And down below, there's a slab on which the body of Christ is believed to have been laid. And those of an even more religious persuasion than ourselves will take handkerchiefs and lay them on there and then carry them back to their hometowns, believing that they have some special significance. But the artwork is quite impressive. And so moving on, we come to the resurrection, the greatest day in the Christian calendar. In fact, the greatest day in human history. and I've depicted the location there with the little red star again. It is very close, actually, to where the crucifixion is believed to have happened. You know the story, but there's the reference there in Mark 16. I won't read all that out, but you can come back to it if we are able to publish this on YouTube. Nearby, there is another place called the Garden Tomb, and this is a relatively recent discovery, but is believed to be something like the sort of tomb that Jesus would have been interred in. I doubt very much whether it is the actual tomb, but it gives a good overall impression of what it was like, with a big stone that would have been rolled down that gully to cover over the entrance. And you may remember that the tomb was donated by Joseph of Arimathea. Within the grounds of the place I was just describing, there's this huge cavity water system, which Jerusalem, obviously up on a mountain, they needed to conserve all the water they could. And Jesus' remains would have been, if it had gone to plan, then a year or so later, the bones would have been removed from the tomb and then placed in these little boxes, an ossuary. That was the Jewish custom, but of course we know that Jesus didn't stay very long in the tomb. He was soon out of there. And we're back in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now, and there are about 7 different religious or Christian denominations that have space within the building. These are the Greek Orthodox, and there are services going on all through the day. This is on the roof again. I think this might be the Ethiopian church that have been kind of given a very small spot there. Oh yeah, there we are. That's inside the little place where they carry out their customs. So it's going to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is quite an amazing ecumenical experience. Highly recommended. So now we're back on the Mount of Olives, looking over the Kidron Valley, and you can see the Dome of the Rock there, the Golden Dome, but beyond in the middle there are some grey domes, and that's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the crucifixion site and the resurrection site. And then we know after Jesus had appeared to his disciples in the upper room, and again he came back a week later for Thomas, after that he met them up in Galilee on the seashore there. And this is a picture of the Mount of Beatitudes, an aerial view. You can see that it's quite a contrast with the urban environment down in Jerusalem, and many people feel closer to the Lord in the Sea of Galilee, that area, than in the city. These are some pictures from the 1930s from Morton's book, and nothing much has changed. This is how it was in 2011 when we were visiting. And this is a place called Tabgha, where Christ is believed to have appeared to the disciples. They've built a chapel over the very spot where there's a big rock, the only rock of its type in that part of the world. And it's quite likely that's where Jesus was seen to be cooking breakfast for his friends when they showed up. And it was here, of course, that Jesus restored Peter and gave him the opportunity to confess his love for the Lord and be reconciled. Well, now we're moving swiftly on to what we're supposed to be talking about today, which is Ascension Day. So I won't take very much longer over this, but we're back in the city of Jerusalem, and 40 days or so have elapsed. This is another view of a reminder of the layout of the city there, with the Kidron Valley running down the middle and the Mount of Olives over on the right. So Jesus and his disciples would have left the city and gone up a path where it says Gethsemane, and there's a route that went directly over the hill to Bethpage, which is not shown on here, but that's the route, a footpath that they would have taken. This is a view of the Mount of Olives from about 50 years ago, And again, it hasn't changed very much. All those little dots you can see are burial places. Yeah, so there's a little path you can see going up the middle of the picture there, and that's the route that is believed to have been taken by the Lord. And there on the top of the hill, we read that in the scriptures that Jesus had some final words for the disciples. And then as they were watching, he was lifted up and a cloud took him out of their sight. We go on to read that they were told not to spend too much longer searching for him, gazing up to heaven, but to go and get on with the business of proclaiming the good news and to entrust that he will return again. Well, a bit message from our leader, from Bishop Rachel. We're encouraged really to honour this day. It's one of the 9 feast days in the Christian year, and yet it's easily overlooked, although I know the Reverend David would have had an early morning service if we'd been allowed to do that. We're doing our best this morning anyway to honour the event in a different way. And then another passage from Scripture from Luke 24. And we read there that while Jesus was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up to heaven. And you can just imagine this is a great day in heaven. The Son has completed his mission to the earth and is returning back triumphant. And just to be clear, this isn't the last, as though we're saying a final goodbye to Jesus, because it's still with us in a different way. And I'm just going to quote now from a book by Michael Perham, who was the former Bishop of Gloucester. It is a day that marks the end of one kind of appearance and presence, but only after it has given way to another. And it celebrates Jesus being with his Father at his right hand and making intercession for us. There is also the sense that man with God is on the throne, in the words of Christopher Wordsworth. And so rather than being heartbroken at Jesus going to heaven, we can be full of appreciation that he is there interceding for us, knowing what it's like to be human, and pleading our case before the Father. And we have that confident hope that Jesus will return again. The disciples had to wait another 10 days for the coming of the Holy Spirit. But this is the site that is where Jesus is believed to have disappeared into the clouds. Margaret, I didn't actually have a chance to visit this, but that's the traditional view anyway, and was uncovered, I think, in the 4th century by Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, and she went on to find many other interesting things in the Holy Land, still of historic interest. And here's a depiction of Christ disappearing. It's very much of its time, sort of Victorian imagery of Jesus floating into the clouds. So I hope you'll find that helpful.